So let's have Norman Wong, our special guest. Let's give him a hand.
Hello, my name's Norman Wong. I'm the great-grandson of Wong Kim Ark. Wong Kim Ark was born in the USA.
Norman Wong is a 75-year-old retiree. He lives near San Francisco, and recently, my colleague David Nakamura went out to California to meet him.
He wasn't really like an activist. He was a carpenter. He sort of did odd jobs in building maintenance. And he suddenly become, once Trump was in office again, this sort of accidental activist who is now called upon to sort of be the public face of the campaign to sort of save birthright citizenship.
That's because Norman's great-grandfather had a huge role in defining birthright citizenship. Here he is telling that story at a recent panel on immigration.
Like my great-grandfather, I too was born American. In the same city, San Francisco, more than 75 years after him. We are both Americans, but unlike him, my citizenship has never been challenged.
Birthright citizenship is something lots of Americans take for granted. It's been settled law in the United States for more than 100 years. Basically, if you're born on U.S. soil, you are American. It doesn't matter where your parents are from or what their immigration status is. But President Donald Trump wants to change that. On the first day of his second term, he signed an executive order that would reinterpret the 14th Amendment and restrict that right.
This next order relates to the definition of birthright citizenship under the 14th Amendment of the United States.
It's a good one. Birthright. That's a big one.
This executive order is now coming before the Supreme Court on Thursday, which is why Norman is speaking out now. Because for him, this is also about protecting his great-grandfather's legacy.
What kind of nation are we to be with stateless children born to no country? To this, I say no.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Elahe Izadi. It's Wednesday, May 14th. Today, I talk with immigration reporter David Nakamura about the little-known case that helped establish birthright citizenship in the U.S. and the new case before the Supreme Court tomorrow. Hi, David. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, thanks for having me.
David, I'm so looking forward to talking to you about this because you found this living connection to a 127-year-old Supreme Court case that helped define birthright citizenship. And this connection comes in the form of Norman Wong. Can you tell me more about Norman and his great-grandfather?
What's interesting is he tells me that he didn't know really about his connection to somebody named Wong Kim Ark, who didn't even really know of growing up.
I knew nothing of him when I was growing up. Never heard the name. My father never talked about anybody in his family.
His father spoke Chinese, went back to Hong Kong quite a bit, worked on a cruise ship and didn't explain a lot about his past. And, these sometimes families did that, right? And so he said he didn't know until, he was in his 50s, around the 100th anniversary of the Wong Kim Ark decision, when there was some hoopla about it. Some Chinese newspapers and others, local papers, wrote about his dad.
And he pulled out these articles and pictures and stuff. And I guess was all in Chinese. That's why, and I couldn't read any of it. And he just kind of explained the best he could, Wong Kim Ark and birthright. And so it was a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people can relate to the idea of you don't really know what happened with your grandparents or your great-grandparents, like your family doesn't really talk about,
right.
But the fact that this man's relative was actually instrumental to establishing this constitutional right it's just kind of remarkable to think about. So tell me a little bit more about who Wong Kim Ark was. Let's start there.
Sure. Wong Kim Ark was a child born in the United States in San Francisco to two parents who were immigrants from China and never became citizens. And he was born in around 1870, and he became sort of a cook. His parents had been merchants. But, he was squarely born in the United States, worked in Chinatown, in some of the Chinatown restaurants in San Francisco. But his family did go back and forth to China like many immigrant families did. And he went back and forth with them a number of times. And ultimately, he was stopped upon trying to re-enter. He was an adult by this time, and he had been visiting his family sort of ancestral village where his parents had returned to. But he was stopped in 1895 by U.S. customs authorities and made to stay essentially in a jail on a steamship in San Francisco Bay.
He wasn't permitted to disembark from the ship. They kept him on a boat for 5 more months while he fought in district court.
And they said, no, you're not permitted. At this time, there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment in the country, including in Congress, which had passed laws prohibiting Chinese laborers from coming in under the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Chinatown, San Francisco was under a lot of pressure. The Chinese there were subjected to quite a bit of violence, not all of it truly documented.
And so that set the stage for him to challenge his inability to get in as a United States citizen, and ultimately that led to this court hearing.
And then tell me about how that court case before the Supreme Court went. I mean, he was someone who was a cook, so it's kind of remarkable that he was able to have this case go before the Supreme Court.
Right. The U.S. government was essentially looking for a case to sort of test this idea. There were proponents against birthright citizenship. Some of the lower courts, there had been some victories among Chinese Americans who had, like I said, won some lower court decisions. But ultimately, there was some pressure on the U.S. government to take a case and try to get to the Supreme Court to sort of go against the idea that the Chinese would be allowed in under birthright citizenship. They were considered threats to the country, culturally not a good fit for the United States. So there were essentially restrictionists who wanted to challenge this, and ultimately it backfired because, Wong Kim-ark was a poor cook. He was not that well educated, but he was essentially helped by the Chinese American community in the San Francisco area that kind of came together and said, we're going to fight. And they had experience in these other cases of banding together, raising money, and essentially hiring white lawyers, prominent ones, to defend them.
Wow, that's fascinating. So the U.S. government, I mean, it kind of feels like a parallel to today in some ways, that the U.S. government wanted to, or there were people who wanted to unravel birthright citizenship, and this case went before. And what did the court ultimately decide?
There were 3 really prominent white lawyers, and they were making the case that essentially the 14th Amendment, that was, of course, ratified by Congress in 1868, in part to grant citizenship to freed Black Americans who had been slaves and their descendants who had been denied that. But they made the case that, of course, this extended to Chinese Americans who were born here. It took 3 years to wind through the court, and ultimately the High Court ruled 6-2 in favor of Wong Kim-ark and established his citizenship.
We've had it squared away for 127 years. Now we want to undo it because we want to go after certain peoples. Well, we're going to start to unravel citizenship as we know it.
Well, and as Norman is saying here, this precedent granted citizenship for so many people born in this country. And now it appears like the Trump administration is trying to change that. And I think that starts with, as we talked about, the executive order that Trump signed in January. So, David, just in basic terms, can you describe what that order meant?
Sure. What Trump's trying to do with his order is to prohibit birthright automatic citizenship to the children of 2 undocumented immigrant parents, as well as children born in the United States to any foreigner who's here on a temporary work, student, or tourist visa. And what him and his supporters are saying, his administration is arguing in court, is that this citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment, which is pretty short, says that birthright citizenship should be granted those born on U.S. soil who are subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S. government, and it's essentially its laws. And they're saying, look, if you're an undocumented immigrant, you came in illegally, you're not fully under the U.S. jurisdiction. You can't be drafted into the military, for example. And so you haven't really pledged full allegiance to the country. This is sometimes considered somewhat of an archaic and previously considered something of a fringe legal theory, but it's been championed by conservatives, some of whom now work in the Trump administration. And Trump flirted with the idea that he would do this in his first term, but he was focused on other immigration type issues. This time, as we know, he came out early in his administration with a number of executive actions related to immigration. And this was one that I think is trying to sort of set a tone and, be another discouragement to those immigrants who might come in part because they hope that their children can be full Americans. This idea that what Trump calls derisively birth tourism and anchor babies, he calls them in very derisive terms, which evidence doesn't not support that this is the idea why most immigrants are coming. They're looking for economic opportunity. But that's why the Trump administration is doing this.
After the break, David breaks down what we need to know about the case going before the Supreme Court tomorrow and how the outcome could have repercussions beyond birthright citizenship. We'll be right back.
My name is Natalie Allison, and I'm a reporter at The Washington Post. I cover the White House. I've covered Donald Trump for the last several years on the campaign trail, and now I'm reporting on him back in power. I am talking to his advisors and his staff, and I'm trying to get answers on not only what they're doing, but why they're doing it, the strategy behind it, and who is involved in making the decisions. Recently at The Washington Post, I was part of our team that was unpacking how Donald Trump's tariff plan came together. We talked about the deference that his advisors showed him in his decision-making, which is a lot different than last time around when people were pushing back, and this time Donald Trump is surrounded by loyalists. When you subscribe to The Washington Post, you support this kind of journalism. Learn more at washingtonpost.com/subscribe. I'm Natalie Allison, and I'm one of the people behind the Post.
So then how did this case end up before the Supreme Court? What happened after Trump signed that executive order? What sort of legal fight did that trigger, and how did it end up in the Supreme Court?
A coalition of states led by Democratic governors and state attorney generals filed suit the day after Trump signed this. Two different groups, actually, of Democratic states split off and did their own separate lawsuits in two different circuit jurisdictions on both sides of the country. But they weren't the only ones. Interest groups, civil rights groups, immigrant rights groups have also filed suits. I think in total, we've counted at least 8 different lawsuits challenging Trump's executive order on birthright citizenship alone. And 3 of those have now reached the point where federal judges in different jurisdictions, each separately in their own cases, issued nationwide injunctions that essentially barred the Trump administration from moving forward at all with preparing to or potentially implementing this ban on birthright citizenship. And so the Trump folks have appealed. But then they said, you know what, we're being stopped on our broader agenda, even beyond immigration, for federal spending and cuts to other areas. And these judges have stopped us too often. So essentially, they asked the Supreme Court to take this birthright citizenship case and rule that the judges have exceeded their authority by stopping this nationwide, that they should limit their injunctions to maybe the plaintiffs in the cases or to the states that sued, but let the administration move forward. The Trump administration is hoping to win this case and get more freedom on many of their initiatives that have been blocked by these judges. So it's a bit confusing, but essentially, Trump wants freedom to go ahead and move beyond these injunctions, at least in some places of the country.
Okay, so basically the court could be taking up this broader idea of injunctions, which play out with this birthright executive order, but it is possible that the justices could weigh in on some level on birthright citizenship itself, right?
It is possible. This is an unusual court hearing to sort of have this sort of fairly quickly on the calendar. And, the Trump administration wanted to get one of these cases about these injunctions up to the court. And this birthright case is such a prominent case. They moved quickly on it. Again, we talked about, sort of the Wong Marks day, the government moving too quickly and essentially losing that case, right? And the backfiring. We'll see with the Trump administration. I think there's a lot of pressure on the judges. It's interesting if some of the judges are sympathetic, and there is a lot of legal scholarship around this injunction question as to should a single judge be able to nationwide ban the administration or temporarily ban them from moving forward on any particular area. But, I think legal scholars look at the birthright question as pretty lock solidly part of U.S. law. So it's an interesting dynamic for the justices and whether they're willing to sort of take on the narrow issue of the injunction and even rule favorably for Trump that could then rebound onto allowing them to move forward to ban birthright citizenship.
What is the counter argument for why this is not constitutional?
Yeah, defenders and supporters of birthright citizenship make the point that, even if you take Trump's arguments at face value, that they're wrong, that essentially that undocumented immigrants are subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S. government. They can be arrested, they can be charged with crimes, they can be deported. And so people are saying that this is not a valid reason to deny something that's been part of the the U.S. system for, over a century, well over a century. And so, I mean, legal experts say that they think this is essentially a bad case for the Trump administration. And because there's been, constitutional law that goes back to this Supreme Court decision of Wong Kim Ark.
So thinking about the Supreme Court as it hears arguments on Thursday around this case, what would happen if the court sides with the administration around just even with the injunction question, even if they don't really touch the constitutionality of birthright citizenship, what could happen to birthright citizenship?
Essentially, the Trump administration in the president's executive order said, look, there would be a certain number of days, I think 30 days or something, where the relevant cabinet secretaries of DHS, of Social Security, other relevant areas that deal with newborns and citizenship questions would have to come up with, essentially guidelines for moving forward to implement the order. And even that was stopped under these things. Technically, they're not supposed to be moving forward and even planning for this. So it could be that they let them move forward on some of the planning, could be that they let them, sort of take other kind of steps to sort of preliminarily, get ready to implement the order. But again, that constitutional question is still being litigated. These nationwide injunctions were only temporary as the question of the constitutionality of this order are litigated. If somehow, though, they fully do grant the administration their argument and rule in their favor, it's possible, like I said, that in some states, Republican-led states that are not part of these lawsuits, it's possible they could try to move forward and implement this ban. And
in those states, let's pick a state and just in, I don't know, I'm just making this up, like Alabama or South Carolina or whatever, no birthright citizenship for people under these circumstances.
Correct.
So if they're born there, then you wouldn't be a citizen?
Well, now you're bringing up a lot of great questions of which...
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, a lot of my sources don't have the best answers, although many of them are flabbergasted at how that would work. A couple of things that, listeners should be aware of if they're not, clear on this is, Trump's order deals with children born after the order takes effect. It doesn't retroactively, if you're born to two undocumented parents and you've been a citizen your whole life, it does not affect you. Okay, number one. How do you then implement it, right? How does the hospital deal with the paperwork for the children? What state do they belong to? What country, I should say? People make the point, these would be stateless kids, right? And so they're born here, but they, their parents may be from another country, but haven't been there in a long time. Like, whose jurisdiction do they fall under? And so that's a huge question. On your question, right, the idea is that the administration say limit these injunctions only to the plaintiffs, right? Are they the Democratic states? Are they the mothers but if they somehow tried to do that, people make the point of would then parents be driving to another state to have birth in the blue state rather than the red state, right? Or does the kid, if they go into a red state, suddenly they're not a citizen? These are a lot of different questions. What I have heard, though, in my reporting, and even when I was in San Francisco, is that the civil rights groups, the interest groups, have a plan B in case they do lose here, that they would try to, I think, file more lawsuits. And we're going far afield here to some degree, but the sort of theoretical questions about injunctions is one thing. And the court may be eager to answer that question. The administration may really want it. But then how it relates to birthright is hard to sort of figure out how that would work.
Yeah. I mean, but so many things happening right now. There are so many unknowns and so many variables and things that people didn't think would be possible before are coming to pass. Which brings me back to Norman Wong and just thinking about how, there's lots of people for whom this is their life, right? They're citizens because they were granted birthright citizenship under this constitutional right or alleged constitutional right. Now it's come into question. And I'm wondering what it's like for him, because obviously it's personal for him like it is for a lot of other people, but it's personal for him in a whole other way. How is he thinking about his great-grandfather's legacy as he watches this case being argued?
Yeah, it's interesting with Norman because when I did meet him in San Francisco, I wondered about how he felt about it all. And he kept saying things during my trip there about, he called himself sort of a prop because he had his picture taken so many times by news photographers and requests from reporters. And he said, he sort of talked in that way and a little bit sheepish almost, like, who am I to talk about? I hardly knew this story. But at the end, though, he did say, look, what his great-grandfather's legacy was for the country is clear. This idea that people are born here or deserve to be Americans with the full benefits of that.
He's a hero, but we can make him my family hero, but let's make an American hero. That in some way, his action, whether he knew it or not, did it for all Americans.
But for him, it gave him a better understanding of himself and his life. And kind of that's why he understands why, even though he sometimes feels like a prop, that he's willing to do it, to speak out, to talk about it.
If people ask me to speak up, I'll speak up. And that's the little I can do.
And then what he said was that ultimately, though, Wong Kim Ark was not someone he knew until he was an adult, and that it's not for him to own. He said, it's not for me to own, he said.
I think it helped Americans become Americans, actually, So That's why I say I don't own him, and I shouldn't even try.
And I think he meant that Wong Kim Ark is for all of us. And so I think that's kind of how he feels. And this idea of who deserves to be an American, and the country's going through this time of what it really means. What is America's to be? And I think ultimately that is where this story lands for me, which is that, this idea, people thought it was settled 127 years ago in this court decision. Then they thought it was settled after the 14th Amendment, but it keeps coming up. And I think, groups that are vulnerable can appreciate that this may never be a fully settled question, and that each generation has to kind of be vigilant and sort of do its part to sort of, defend what it believes is the right way to go.
David, thanks so much for sharing the story with us.
Yeah, happy to.
David Nakamura is an immigration reporter for The Post. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. Today's episode was produced by Laura Benshoff with help from Emma Talkoff. It was mixed by Sean Carter and edited by Maggie Penman. Thanks to Christine Amario. We'll be covering oral arguments tomorrow in real time on our site, WashingtonPost.com. So tune in to follow along with what the justices are asking, what each side is saying, and what to make of it all. And if you want to learn more about Wong Kim Ark and his landmark Supreme Court case, we'll include a link in our show notes to a fascinating episode of another Post podcast, Constitutional. I'm Elahe Izadi. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.